Spend a minute watching on YouTube the launch and re-landing of the SpaceX Starship, and it takes a hard heart not to be inspired and feel a little emotional with the incredible achievements of the company that from startup in 2002 now designs, manufactures and launches the world's most advanced rockets and spacecraft. In this show, we talk to Eric Berger, Space Insider, who's written a thrilling account of the early days of SpaceX, having talked to all its founders.
Hi friends, welcome to The Evolving Leader. I'm Scott Allender, along with my friend and a man who's seen it all but can't remember it, Mr. John Gomes.
Oh dear.
How are you feeling, John?
I'm feeling out of this world. How are you feeling, Scott?
I see what you did there. You said you're feeling out of this world because
we've got to get some better jokes on the show.
Well, let me try to come up with one. I'm feeling ready to blast off. Yeah, I know that's bad.
Oh, this is terrible.
Well, let me just before we introduce our guest, let me set the stage for a second. So, today, Elon Musk's Tesla continues to shake VW, Ford, and others from their addiction to the internal combustion engine. But perhaps even more incredible is the success of SpaceX, valued in April of this year at $74 billion. So when you look at that level of commercial disruption that is created, it's perhaps not surprising that the company offers rocket launches today at a quarter of the cost of incumbents, and it's aiming to go even lower as their machines become reusable.
Yeah, I mean, in April, the company caught the headlines winning a contract, total award $2.89 billion to send astronauts to explore more of the moon as part of the Artemis program. A couple of months before that, perhaps even less reported, was another contract with the US government for nearly $1 billion, 800 and something million, to provide broadband in rural areas, which is probably actually more interesting in terms of long-term strategy. And it's been rumored that they're in similar talks with Britain about that.
That's incredible. So today we are joined by Eric Berger, who has written a thrilling book about the early days of SpaceX called Liftoff. Eric, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Gene. Nice to be here.
Eric, welcome. Can we start with a quick tour of your career and how you got to be able to get the insider's story on SpaceX?
Sure. So I had a background in astronomy and journalism and covered science for the Houston Chronicle for a decade and a half. But for the latter part of that period, I became more and more interested in space. Obviously, Houston is Space City. It's where the astronauts live and train. It's where mission control is. But I became frustrated with kind of what NASA was doing and what the US Congress was telling them to do, because it was really sort of, they were spinning their wheels in a lot of respects. And the real change, the real drive forward was actually coming from outside of NASA through the commercial space industry. And SpaceX was the exemplar of that. They were leading that charge. And so I became, more interested in the company, and they just continued to become more disruptive. And it was at the Falcon Heavy launch in 2018. That was when they had built privately the world's largest rocket. And then they launched it successfully on their first try. That was when they sent Elon's Tesla to Mars. And then the two side boosters landed. It was at that moment that I realized that they weren't just disruptive; they were, potentially transformative. And so I wanted to write about it. So it was really a progression of becoming more interested in space, and then realizing where the action in the 21st century really was, and then wanting to get deeper and deeper in understanding that.
So, can you take us back to the first days when Elon Musk was just leaving PayPal with a lot of money? Why space? Why was he so willing to risk his fortune on this idea when did, the idea of colonizing Mars and making the quest of man as a multi-planetary species become the mission for him?
Yeah, so it's kind of crazy, right? He was this nerdy, kind of awkward guy in his 30s, back in the early 2000s, 2001. And, Musk has these existential concerns, right? He's worried about climate change. which explains Tesla and solar panels and the electric cars.
Mm-hmm.
He's worried about AI. He talks about that sort of, evil AI. And he's worried about, the future of humanity being wiped out by some kind of accident on Earth, be it an asteroid, nuclear disaster, runaway climate change, you name it. There are situations in which humanity could literally be wiped out because we're only on one planet. So he wants to make humans a multiplanetary species. And there are no other Earths in the solar system, but Mars is a good place to start. So he looked at all of this back in 2000 and decided that he wanted to start in space. It's not like he was the first. There had been other entrepreneurs that had come along and tried to build rocket companies, but he figured the first step was to be able to demonstrate that a private company could build a rocket, and then it would go from there. But it was absolutely, the vision from day one was absolutely sending humans to Mars.
Let's go to this Pacific atoll where they ran their first experiments. Who was there? Who had he pulled together? How had he got there? And why didn't he do the traditional partnership with the US Army, which other people had tried to do in the past?
So they launched their first 5 rockets from this tiny atoll in the central Pacific Ocean. Basically, to get there, you would fly, from Los Angeles to Hawaii, and then fly the same distance again westward. So it was a long haul. It was literally in the middle of nowhere. And they went there because they essentially got run off of Vandenberg Air Force Base. So they had originally planned to launch the Falcon 1 rocket from a launch site just a couple hours north of Los Angeles, an Air Force base. The problem was that there were other customers there, particularly Lockheed Martin and Boeing, who had their rockets, and they were the prime contractors for the government. So they were launching the valuable spy satellites and military communication satellites, and those had much higher priority than this kind of ragtag bunch from SpaceX who were trying to launch a rocket. So the government was concerned that if SpaceX launched the rocket and there was an accident, it might destroy or damage their satellites or rockets or other facilities nearby. And so they were basically told, so that in May of 2005, they finally successfully static fire tested the Falcon 1. So that means they clamped it down and then fired it for about 20 seconds, and it showed that it was kind of ready to launch. And the US government basically said, you can't go yet, right? You got to wait until this rocket's off the pad. We don't know when it's going to launch. And the difficulty for Musk is that he was trying to do space in a much more commercial fashion. And what I mean by that is almost entirely up to that point, the way it worked was a big government contractor, they bid on contracts to launch satellites or build rockets. And the government would give Lockheed, here's $2 billion. We want you to build this kind of rocket to service this kind of missions. And then Lockheed would take that money and take their cost plus a fee and do that service for the government. What Musk was doing was actually investing private money in the Falcon 1 rocket, and then wanted to use, once it was developed, then sell that to commercial customers, to put satellites in orbit as well as the government. So he was not getting paid to while his rocket was on ice. So they went to their backup option, which was this tiny island in the Pacific, and there was a small army base there, but there was no one else trying to launch rockets, so they had a lot more autonomy, and that was really good for them in the sense that SpaceX likes to operate at its own speed. And Elon likes to go fast. And so there were fewer hurdles for him there. The problem is that it was, 4,000 or 8,000 miles from LA. And so the logistics of launching a rocket in the middle of the Pacific Ocean are pretty immense.
Tell us a little bit about the team he pulled together to do this.
Right. So yeah, you had asked about who was there. It was basically 24 engineers and technicians who worked for him. So when he started SpaceX, he hired about 4 vice presidents who were in their 30s or early 40s. So these were people who had experience in the space industry, to help. Tom Mueller did the propulsion, so the rocket engine. Tim Buzza did launch and testing. Chris Thompson did structures, and Hans Koenigsmann did the computer, the avionics of the rocket. But then, the plan was to go out and find really smart, hardworking college graduates. Like, so kids who were either in undergraduate, had in graduate school, or had just graduated. And you could pay them less and expect them to work more because they didn't, typically they didn't have families, houses, or other sort of things that really would keep them tied down. And so he was very good at finding these students and hiring them at SpaceX. And what he offered them, first of all, for them, it was an eyes wide open experience. Like, they knew what they were getting into. They were getting into 80-hour weeks, but they were also, getting to build stuff that was flying soon. It was a very hands-on experience. And they liked that. And I think they liked the challenge of trying to be the first private company to do this. It was sort of a badge of honor that, this company with a couple hundred employees was doing something that typically took thousands of employees and a lot more money. And I think why there are so many SpaceX quote fanboys out there, or people who just get really excited about the company, is because the company, they put in 20 years of really hard work to get to where they are today. And those first 6 or 7 years were dotted by a lot of failure, as I document in Liftoff. But they again got to the point in 2010 where they started to have some success. And it's snowballed. They've had some setbacks since, but it's largely snowballed since then to the point where they're pretty dominant today. But what's different about SpaceX, and again, I think you have to attribute this to Musk, is that their goal is not to become the dominant launch company or like win the most government contracts or be the NASA's biggest contractor. Like, this was all just setting the stage for what they want to do, really, which is send humans to Mars. And so they're building this Starship vehicle. And what's exciting about that, from my perspective, is it really is the first launch vehicle that feels like it's from the pages of a science fiction novel. Just like, for one small example, like, go back to the lunar module in the Apollo program, where they took 2 astronauts down to the surface of the moon, right? Pretty great feat of engineering. I got the job done, but it took 2 people down to the moon for a few days. If they had stripped away the crew compartment on the lunar module, and there were some studies done on this, like how much cargo, let's say you wanted to build a moon base, how much cargo could you get to the moon using this huge, prodigious Saturn V rocket that flew once with this tiny lunar module on top, but was absolutely the pinnacle of our technology back then? The answer is about 8 to 10 tons. Okay, well, that's not bad. Starship, by contrast, is designed to be in it, and technically they've got a ways to go, so it's not a fait accompli. But if they succeed, and they're pretty good engineers, it's fully reusable launch system. And you're talking about not sending 2 astronauts down to the moon, but you could send dozens at a time. And if you were to take Starship and run it fully reusable, like, you would launch the vehicle, then launch some more to fill it with fuel, and then it goes to the moon, then takes off the moon and comes back to Earth and lands on Earth, and it's ready to go again, you could take 50 tons to the moon. But if you were to take that single Starship vehicle and just send it to the moon to stay, like, it doesn't, like the lunar module, it would just stay, it could take 200 tons of cargo to the moon. So 20 times more. So if you're someone at NASA trying to think about what you could really do on the moon with 200 tons of mission, that you could do a hell of a lot. If you're a private company thinking, man, if I could get 10 tons of the moon and pay for 1/20th of that mission's cost, I mean, it literally, so in addition to like potentially being able to take humans to Mars, it just absolutely changes the game in terms of the economics of the cost of launch and what you can actually do, because you can put so much stuff out there. So it's very exciting. And I go back to this, the cool thing about it is that SpaceX didn't sort of get to the point where they're the world's best launch company and then they could go public and make a ton of money and make their shareholders happy. It's like, no. All of that was just the precursor to doing the science fiction stuff that just would radically change the game of spaceflight and break us out of this mode we've been in since, the Apollo era, where we've been in the thrall of these big aerospace companies and just have not gotten that much done. It's very exciting to me as a space cadet, I guess.
No, that is. And I mean, not only is that amazingly disruptive, but as you say, it could transform the future of what we do on the moon as a starting point.
Transform the future of our species into an actual spacefaring species.
Yeah.
That's the big thing. It's huge, in my opinion.
Wow. So one of the things that I read in your book that was so interesting to me was that he put his chances of SpaceX succeeding at less than 10%, which seems that this fuels a sort of, mindset that allows for failure, for experimentation, for risk, for embracing uncertainty, et cetera. Can you tell us a bit about what you learned from getting to know these players? And I'd even be curious about how he was so successful at attracting this talent when his outlook for success was pretty shaky.
So I'm not sure he shared that outlook for success with the people he hired. I think he was pretty confident with them. And I think there's a little bit of Elon in that 10% kind of looking back and sort of underselling himself a little bit. He is always trying to set expectations. But the fact of the matter is that the odds were against SpaceX succeeding. He's definitely correct about that. So why did he get people to come work for him? He's a pretty compelling guy when you're around him. He's super intense, obviously. And their friends were going to work there. Like, it was the place to go if you wanted to be challenged as an engineer. And it was the place to go. I tell some anecdotes in the book, but if you went to a more traditional aerospace company, and were smart and advanced, your job was mostly going to be pushing paper, right? Getting approvals, dealing with the government, yada, yada, yada. And at SpaceX, they all sat in cubicles in the office that was right next to the factory, and they were on the factory floor as much as they were in their offices, or they were at the test sites, firing engines or tanks. So it was a dirty hands job. And I think that the engineers appreciated the fact that they could see what they were doing was having a direct impact. And it was a place to go if you really wanted to get something done, because so much in the space industry moves so slowly. The James Webb Space Telescope is supposed to launch this year. It's been under development for more than 2 decades.
Wow.
So imagine you were a scientist who had the idea for the James Webb Space Telescope in the 1990s. And we're like, man, think about how I could use this to further my career. And so then you spend 25 years, waiting for it to be built and getting all the funding and just, it's at SpaceX, there's none of that. It's Elon Musk, who's the CEO, and he's also the chief financial officer. So if he decided something was important, he would spend money and he would ask for it to be done immediately. And so it just was a place to go get things done. And I think that really appealed to the engineers he hired.
So let's get into that even more. So he kind of took this Silicon Valley playbook of rapid, iterative test and learn cycles. Not something familiar, to your point, to the linear engineering world of space. How difficult was it, or was it difficult for him to get that approach embedded in the culture?
So yeah, that's a great point, Scott. His background was in software, and so I think he sort of learned from that approach where you write some code, run it, see what happens, and then debug it, and took that mindset, in this iterative mindset, into space hardware, which really was a novel thing. And I think he just, it's sort of force of personality, force of will that he instilled this. And I think it became a point of pride from the people who worked from him, because they could see that, you could sit around and run computer simulations for months if you wanted to assess the failure modes of your rocket or your engine or your test tank or whatever. Or you could just build one, test it and see what happens. If it worked, great. And if it didn't work, then what you figure out what went wrong and fixed it. One of his great things, I think, in space is that he was willing to demonstrate failure in a very public way. And since then, some of the space industry's come along with that and some is not. Like NASA cannot afford to fail in terms of the public mind, because then Congress starts asking questions about, well, why are you doing this program if you can't succeed? And they cancel the program then. SpaceX doesn't have, 100 senators and 435 or whatever U.S. representatives, looking over its back and expecting jobs in their districts and all this stuff. They have one stakeholder, and he wants to go fast, and that's the over time he's found that's the way to do it through iterative design.
We want to hear from you. Send us your leadership questions on Instagram @EvolvingLeader, and John and Scott will address them in a future show. And be sure you're subscribed to the Evolving Leader podcast on your favorite platforms so you catch all of our exciting new content. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get back to the show.
So you described many points in the company's life where it could have died or it would have sunk other leaders and teams. Can you pick one or two battles or setbacks that really stand out, and how Musk and the other leaders managed to stay on course?
Yeah, I think one of those times when they could have really maybe not died, but gone under was after their first failure in 2006. Everyone had expected them to fail, and they did. The engine got on fire, and not in a good way, and it only flew for about 30 seconds. And by that time, his money was starting to run out. But a couple of years earlier, or about a year earlier, he had actually protested an award that NASA had given to another company. And it's a bit complicated, but basically he had the vision to say, SpaceX ought to be competing for this contract. It was unfair that NASA awarded it without a competition. And even though NASA is my most important customer potentially, I'm going to protest this. And I'm going to say, NASA, you were wrong. I'm right. And this is important. And that's difficult to do, because you don't really want to crap on your most important potential customer. But he did it. And because he did that, a year later, they were in line to compete for this contract to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. And so they got about $278 million, an award in the summer of 2006. And that money really allowed them to grow and build their teams and survive the next two failures of the Falcon 1 rocket, which I'm not sure they would have done if they hadn't had that NASA money and sort of the resources that provided. Because by the late summer of 2008, they were out of money again. A lot of the NASA money was gone. Elon's wealth was gone. And that's why even after the successful launch of the Falcon 1 in September of 2008, they very nearly went bankrupt until they got another NASA contract. And so I don't think people fully realize, like, SpaceX does these amazing things in space, and in some ways they've surpassed what NASA can do. But NASA has been instrumental in the company's success, almost from the beginning. As I say, after that protest, which the two sides sort of set aside and moved on from. So they've been important partners now for 15 years.
That's interesting. Earlier this season, we had Ed Liu on our show. For anybody listening who might not have heard that episode, Ed is a former NASA astronaut and now has a side gig as a advisor to SpaceX among saving Earth from asteroid collision. So, his work is almost as important and impactful as what John and I do here on The Evolving Leader. But one of the things that he said that really stuck with us was that he felt that SpaceX had captured the spirit that NASA had in the 60s and had lost. Sounds kind of like you're saying the same thing, that you kind of see that.
Yeah, I'd say two things about that. First of all, Ed's great. Very knowledgeable and sort of does very important work in sort of making sure we're doing the best job we can do to track threatening asteroids. So it's great that you had him on. With two things. First of all, sort of an anecdote. Tim Buzza was the launch director for SpaceX. And so he told me about, they were in their flight control room on Kwajalein before the fourth launch of the Falcon 1, the one where if they failed again, they were going under. And he basically told me that he looked around that room and there were a couple of graybeards like himself, who was about 40 years old. And he said it was other than that, it was like people in their 20s. And he told the team that this was just like it was like for, Chris Kraft and sort of Gene Kranz in the Apollo landing days, where those flight controllers in mission control were in their 20s with a few senior leaders. And so he felt that was very much like that moment. So I think you're right, Scott, and I think Ed's right about that. The other thing I would say is that one of the remarkable things about SpaceX is that, Musk founded them in 2002 with this vision for going to Mars, an idea that they were going to disrupt the industry. What's notable to me 19 years later here in 2021 is that SpaceX is still seeking to disrupt. They have absolutely gone from being David to being Goliath in the launch industry. Every country and every other company is trying to catch up to their technology, and frankly probably won't. But they now are like NASA's most important contractor. I'm not sure NASA would admit it, but it's true. And they're still being disruptive. They still have the founder's mentality. They still have this culture that was laid down during the early years. And frankly, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write Liftoff, was to really understand that kind of founding culture that made them different than everyone else. And what's notable again is that culture still exists. They have a picture of that fourth Falcon 1 launch hanging in Elon's executive conference room in Hawthorne to sort of remind them of the scrappiness of those early days and sort of all they went through to reach that point. And they're taking that same approach to the Starship program. They're iterating, they're trying to move fast. And so, somehow 2 decades later, they haven't become, they get like almost 10,000 employees. You would think that you would start to become like a big company, right? Mm-hmm. But they still have that founder's mentality, and I think it's obviously due to Elon, who's still deeply involved with SpaceX.
Yeah, and it seems that he is, deeply into the culture of the organization. He's not only just into the engineering challenges, but he is the culture in many ways. We're all kind of fascinated by him, and it's that embodied on the T-shirt of out sweat, out drink, out launch. What did you really learn about Musk as a person?
So very complicated person. I think on one hand, you can't help but admire the absolute success that he's had in disrupting both the space launch industry and the automotive industry. I mean, you don't take on Toyota and GM and Ford and Hyundai and Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop and Aerojet and yada, 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 these established blue chip companies who are accustomed to having the market their way and just sort of, as I say, disrupt both industries without, I mean, if you do it once, maybe it's a fluke, but if you do it twice, no, it's pretty clear that there's a common denominator there. But to get things done like that, you got to be a jerk sometimes. And he doesn't come off well on Twitter. He certainly rubs some people the wrong way. He's very brash. And I think the SpaceX takes on that persona. He can be a jerk, right? And he he oftentimes doesn't have a whole lot of empathy for people. And if people attack him, he attacks back harder. So he's not particularly measured in that sense. But, in spending time around him and dealing with, and the other thing that kind of is a little troubling to me is like, if you're helping him at SpaceX, like get where he wants to go, which is build things, move fast, then great. But if you're no longer of use to him or the company, you're flushed out pretty quickly. But sort of beneath all that, I think what's the most interesting thing to me that I found in talking to him and talking to people who worked closely with him for a long time is that he genuinely cares about this stuff. Like he did not found SpaceX to get government launch contracts. He like genuinely wants to send humans to Mars, which, oh, by the way, is something that NASA is never going to do, or at least not in our lifetimes with the current system it has. It's just preposterous. And any talk that they would is ridiculous. But SpaceX is building a launch system that could theoretically make that happen. And he's very genuine about that. And he's just kind of nerdy, and he can be, when he's in a good mood, he can be very funny. He's a dad, like, got to see him a little bit with some of his boys, and like, it's like, it's not Elon Musk, international man of mystery. It's like Elon Musk dad, right? And it was kind of interesting to see that side of him. So he's very complicated. On one hand, he does these enormously admirable things, but yeah, like all humans, he has his faults.
So SpaceX's success seems to owe a lot to the skill of Gwen Shotwell, the company's president and chief operating officer, who seems to have been an expert at getting those contracts for satellite launches from NASA that was so critical to the success of the organization. How did she work alongside Musk? Were there any parallels, say, with Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, or was it completely different?
I think it's different. I mean, what's interesting to me about Elon and Gwen is that they're very different personality-wise, because Elon is, as I say, sort of awkward, can be abrasive, and is not always comfortable public speaking. But Gwen is very smooth. Everyone in the space industry loves her. Even her competitors certainly respect her and appreciate her personality. She can talk to anyone, very comfortable, funny. But underneath that, she is like as ruthless as he is, and as determined as he is to disrupt the industry. She told me that when she was thinking about taking the job, had just turned 40 years old. This was in 2002. She was in the middle of a divorce. She had young children. She was renovating her condo. So she's like, I had a lot going on in my life, and so it was a pretty big decision to go work for this guy that no one had ever heard of, because she had a good career in aerospace. But the reason she did it she told me, is that she knew where the industry was and where the industry was going, and saw how slowly it was moving and how predicated it was on big companies winning government contracts. And then she saw Elon's vision for this, which was to move quickly, develop, vertically integrate company, do things much more commercially. And she was attracted to that. And that's why she went. I mean, she believes in the SpaceX mission of, utterly disrupting the industry. And so she has been indispensable to him, because I think he can trust her. He knows that she's on his side. And so she's been enormously important. I think Tesla lacks something for not having a Gwen Shotwell, for sure. Another interesting thing is that so Jeff Bezos, who has his own rocket company, Blue Origin, was really struggling a few years ago and went out to hire a new CEO, or hire a CEO for the first time. And then he approached Shotwell about taking the job, and she said no. So she was happy. She was happy at SpaceX and Elon for, but I think it's really important for him to have someone, as I say, he can trust, but also who is absolutely pushing his vision, which she shares in a different but equally effective and important way.
It's really interesting. You mentioned Blue Origin. How much of the kind of battle between Bezos and Musk is real, and what's theater?
I think it's very real. They both have huge egos. I think in reality, it hasn't been a battle because SpaceX has just dominated them since over the last 5 years. It was really interesting. If you go back to December of 2015, so a little more than 5 years ago, Blue Origin had just successfully launched its New Shepard vehicle into suborbital space, but then it came back down and landed. And it was the first time we'd seen a vertically launched rocket do that. It was very cool. And then a few months later, Spacex went to orbit with the Falcon 9 and came back for the first time. And Jeff Bezos tweeted, "Welcome to the club," right? which Elon did not appreciate because, going above 100 kilometers above the Kármán line, but doing suborbital is about 1% the energy of an orbital launch. So it's on one hand, it's comparable, but on the other hand, it's like what SpaceX did was very much more impressive. So for a new space reporter like myself, who's like covering this commercial space industry closely and is intensely interested in it, it was like, oh my God, we've got the world's richest person in Bezos. And he's finally revealing his rocket company to the world. And he's going to be taking on SpaceX and we're going to have this amazing commercial space race. They both believed in vertical launch, reusable rockets, bringing down the cost of access to space. That was like fundamental to both of them. They both had the idea of landing their rockets on drone ships. I mean, Bezos sued SpaceX for violating a patent that he claimed on an autonomous drone ship. It was eventually dismissed, but I mean, they both had the same ideas, and then we just have not had that race. Like over the last 5 years, Blue Origin has flown New Shepard 15 more times, and that's it. Although they're going to put humans on the vehicle in July, and that's pretty cool. But if you stack that up against what SpaceX has done over the last 5 years, more than 100 orbital launches, launched Crew 3 times, the International Space Station now and counting, has launched more satellites into orbit than any country or company combined with Starlink. Like they are now the operator of the largest satellite constellation in the world, and it's not close. They built the world's largest rocket with the Falcon Heavy. They got the contract for the human landing system. They're now on par with United Launch Alliance for military satellite contracts. The scope of their accomplishments and what Blue Origin has done is it hasn't been a race. There's been no race. It's been very disappointing for me to watch what Blue Origin has done over the last 5 years.
Do you see anybody else in the market that's coming in to disrupt it that could potentially be, the next? Has anybody been inspired by SpaceX to become the next kind of challenger in this market? So in sort of launch and in space stuff, the only Western company that really has a chance to be equally disruptive is Rocket Lab, in my opinion, because Peter Beck is their CEO and he's very ambitious, and is actually talked about building a rocket called Neutron, which is a little bit smaller than the Falcon 9, but could potentially be a challenger in terms of reuse. And so they're a company I think that's interesting. But outside of that, God bless them, but the European space industry is way too stodgy and way too distributed across too many countries and way too bureaucratized to compete with SpaceX. And the United Launch Alliance, their main competitor, is kind of steadily falling behind, although they have their position is probably guaranteed because the military wants 2 separate companies to get them into space. So the only real threat, I think, to SpaceX is dominance is China, because about 5 years ago, their government decided it was going to privatize some of its technology. And so it encouraged investment in companies and I think has supported them financially as well, to sort of
try to develop a commercial space industry there. And so that's been important. And then a lot of those companies are developing rockets that look a lot like the Falcon 9. With the idea of vertical takeoff, landing, and reuse. And then the government just put out a video a few months ago with a rocket prototype that looked a hell of a lot like Starship. So I think they're seeing what SpaceX is doing and trying to emulate it. And they have sort of the wherewithal and the knowledge to, I think, do that, sort of to be the most important competitor long-term to SpaceX.
That's really interesting. Well, sometimes when we talk about folks like, characters like Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or Musk, it feels like we're talking a bit about, these purple unicorns, that these are these sort of standout, unique stories because their stories and their, innovativeness is nearly impossible to emulate. So it also makes them, when we think of them that way, a bit easy to dismiss as almost mythical, like predicting where lightning might strike. And in doing that, it becomes very possible that someone listening to you right now may miss the leadership lessons in this. So I'd be really interested for our listeners if you had a couple of nuggets of sort of takeaways from the leadership lessons that you've observed with SpaceX, with Musk, with the people that you've been speaking with.
Yeah, I think, Elon Musk started with money. Like, he put about 100 million into SpaceX, but that is not, in the space industry, that was not world-changing money by any stretch of the imagination. It was, probably enough to get the first rocket to orbit, he thought, but not more than that. So he was very frugal with his money. So it wasn't so much the financial wherewithal, although that's important. I think it was more that he had a clear and compelling vision. And then just there's something inside of him that is I've never seen before, but he just every day sort of gets up and is figuring, and his goal is to go faster than he did the day before and figure out ways for his companies to solve the technical challenges before them, to do it faster and cheaper. And it's just relentless. Being around him a little bit, it's kind of exhausting. So I have a great admiration for people that work closely with him, because he just never lets up with his demands on them and sort of, we need to find a better way to do this, and that's not going to work. And so, you've got to do this, or you've got to shave 100 kilograms from this, this part of the rocket, or just whatever. I mean, it's constant with him, this sort of drive to move forward and to accelerate. And anything that gets in his way sort of is pushed aside. But I think it's important, for leaders to have a clear and compelling vision, and then to be able to articulate that to the people. So when he does his interviews for hires, Elon will talk about his vision for SpaceX. At least he had to do in the early days when he, I think everyone sort of understands it now that's coming into the business. But he would, as Shotwell said, he was compelling, but he was also a little scary because he sort of had this such grandiose vision. I mean, sending humans to Mars, a private company, come on. I mean, it still seems a little preposterous today, but 20 years ago, it would have been insane. And then you got to work. I mean, he has an incredible work ethic, right? He's always at Tesla or SpaceX, or he sometimes takes little trips, but I mean, he's working hard. Like, there's no joke about that. And watching him in meetings, it's like he's always trying to help his team solve problems. So he's like, okay, you need to find this and do this and do this and have this all together by 72 hours from now. And if you run into any problems, email me and I'll take care of it. And so he would call the CEO of a crane company or whatever, or make sure they had enough plumbers or welders or whatever. And so just very kind of hands-on in solving problems. And the one thing his engineers told me is that he always tried to solve the hardest problems first. Like, he didn't sort of say, well, let's get the low-hanging fruit out and then we'll work up to it. No, he was like, what's the hardest, biggest, most important problem? Let's solve that, and then we'll work on the other stuff.
In your all of these interviews that you did with the founders and the teams, SpaceX. What was the thing that, as you look back in the writing of the book, that was most surprising to you, the thing you didn't expect to hear or see?
I think it was the extent to which he really was involved, because, going into the book, you have to wonder, well, is it just kind of a rich guy with a vision, and then sort of, was flouncing around while his engineers did the hard work. And there certainly is like Musk could not be like the world's best expert in rocket engines and the world's best expert in structures and the world's best expert in computer avionics. So he had very smart people, but he legitimately was deep into those technical discussions about those issues. And so he, on one hand, he was out there sort of setting the vision and the public vision for SpaceX and a lot of charisma. And on the other hand, he was very much in the technical weeds. And I think you can draw a pretty significant contrast between him and someone like Richard Branson, who founded Virgin Galactic and Virgin Orbit. And, sometimes like they're lumped together, like the new space visionaries, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson. And it's kind of a disservice to Musk because he's sort of the showman that Branson is, but Branson is just entirely about the marketing, like has no desire or, to get into like any of the engineering details. And I think Bezos is kind of a hybrid. He's done some aerospace engineering and does get involved in the technical decisions with his rockets, but it's not to the extent that Musk does. And so I think I was impressed by the fact that you could really attribute a lot of the success of SpaceX to him, genuinely. Now the book is not so much about him as it is about the people who actually carried it out. So he had a lot of help, but, he hired those people and he motivated them and he kept them, working 80 hours a week when they had offers to go other places.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, actually.
Yeah, that was incredible, Eric. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Scott and Gene. I had a great time.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you want to learn more about SpaceX and these incredible stories that Eric writes about, be sure to order a copy of Liftoff today. And until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?